James had always found comfort in his home, a large old Victorian house nestled at the edge of a quiet town. It was the kind of house with creaky floorboards and hidden nooks, where shadows danced at night, and every whisper felt like an echo from another time. The garden, lush and sprawling, was his favorite place, his sanctuary from the chaos of his demanding job. But lately, James felt a gnawing unease whenever he stepped outside. The garden, once vibrant and full of life, seemed darker, almost sinister. The ivy that clung to the walls looked like it was reaching, twisting in ways that defied the breeze. And the gardener, Paul, a burly man with a weathered face, was always there, tending to the plants as if he were communing with them. James had never paid much attention to him. The man did his job, kept the garden immaculate, and didn't ask questions. But there was something about Paul that had started to feel off. One evening, as James poured himself a drink, he glanced out the window. There was Paul, kneeling by the rose bushes, his hands buried in the soil. But he wasn't planting or pruning. No, Paul was digging, deep and slow. James watched, feeling the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Paul's movements were methodical, almost ritualistic. And then James saw it, a flash of something white being buried. It was quick but unmistakable. James' heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to confront Paul, to demand answers. But a cold, creeping fear rooted him to the spot. Instead, he waited until Paul had left for the day. As soon as he was sure the gardener was gone, James rushed out into the garden. He dug where he had seen Paul digging, his hands trembling with every scoop of earth. What he found sent a chill down his spine. A small, white cloth, stained with what looked like blood. James recoiled, his mind racing. What was this? Why was it here? And why did it feel like a secret meant to stay hidden? He couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was just beginning to unravel. That night, James couldn't sleep. The image of the blood-stained cloth haunted him, gnawing at the edges of his mind. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. Next to him, his wife, Clara, slept soundly, her breathing slow and even. James turned to look at her, studying her face in the pale moonlight that filtered through the curtains. She looked peaceful, serene even, but something about her calm demeanor felt unnervingly out of place, given what he'd just discovered. Around midnight, James decided to get up. He needed to clear his head, to make sense of the unease that gripped him. He walked downstairs and poured himself another drink, trying to shake off the tension. As he sat in the dimly lit living room, he noticed Clara's phone on the coffee table, screen dimly glowing with an unread notification. James hesitated. He had never been one to snoop, but something compelled him to pick up the phone. It was just a missed call. No name, just a number. But the call was from earlier that evening, just minutes before James had seen Paul in the garden. His pulse quickened. He glanced toward the stairs, making sure Clara was still asleep. When he unlocked the phone, what he found was a slew of recent calls and messages exchanged between Clara and an unknown number. James scrolled through the texts, his breath catching as the words unfolded before him. They were filled with intimate details, confessions, and promises that turned his stomach. Clara had been texting Paul, the gardener. The messages spoke of secret meetings, whispered plans, and something far darker that he couldn't quite piece together yet. As he read, the screen flickered, and Clara's phone rang. A call from the same unknown number. James hesitated, the shrill ringtone slicing through the silence of the night. He didn't answer, but the call continued, as if daring him to confront whatever lay on the other end. Finally, it stopped, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. James felt like he was teetering on the edge of a precipice, and with every new revelation, the ground beneath him crumbled a little more. From upstairs, Clara's voice suddenly called out, sleepy and annoyed. "James? What are you doing?" James quickly set the phone back down, his mind racing. He had to play it cool, had to keep his suspicions hidden until he could figure out what was really going on. But as he turned to face her, standing there at the top of the stairs, he couldn't help but feel that Clara's eyes held secrets even darker than the garden outside. The next morning, James went through the motions of normalcy. But the tension between him and Clara was palpable. Clara moved about the kitchen, making breakfast as if nothing were wrong. James tried to eat, but every bite felt like sawdust in his mouth. The sight of Clara, smiling sweetly as she poured coffee, made his skin crawl. He knew he had to find out more, but he couldn't confront her. Not yet. Later, when Clara left for a yoga class, James seized the opportunity. He walked to the garden, where Paul was already at work, trimming the hedges with a focused intensity. James approached cautiously, trying to mask his suspicion with a forced smile. "Morning, Paul," James said, his voice strained. "Anything new going on?" Paul barely glanced up, his expression unreadable. "Just the usual, sir." James nodded, watching Paul's hands deftly snip the branches. "I was wondering," James continued, trying to sound casual, "do you keep a journal or notes about the garden? For keeping track of what needs to be done." Paul paused, his gaze sharp and piercing. For a moment, James thought he'd overstepped. But then Paul gave a slow nod. "Yeah, I keep a journal. Helps me remember what's been planted where." "Mind if I take a look?" James asked, his voice betraying a hint of desperation. Paul hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly before he relented. He pulled a small, worn notebook from his back pocket and handed it over. "Just be careful with it." James flipped through the pages, expecting to find mundane notes about soil conditions and pruning schedules. But instead, he found cryptic entries. Dates and times matched with initials, symbols, and strange, unsettling descriptions. One entry, dated just a few weeks ago, caught his attention. "See, midnight. By the roses. The seed is planted. The roots will take hold soon." A chill ran down James's spine. He snapped the journal shut and handed it back, trying to hide the tremor in his hand. "Thanks, Paul. Just wanted to make sure everything was in order." Paul nodded, but his eyes never left James, watching him with a guarded, almost predatory look. James turned and walked back to the house, feeling Paul's gaze burning into his back. As James stepped inside, Clara was waiting for him in the hallway. "What were you doing out there?" she asked, her tone sharp. "Just talking to Paul," James said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Wanted to see how the garden was coming along." Clara's eyes flickered with something, anger or perhaps fear. "You shouldn't be bothering him so much. He has work to do." James forced a smile, but his mind was racing. He knew now that whatever was happening, Clara and Paul were in it together. And from the looks of that journal, it was far from over. James spent the rest of the day in a daze, trying to piece together the fragments of what he had discovered. He couldn't shake the feeling that the garden held more secrets than he could ever imagine. The entry in Paul's journal, "The seed is planted," echoed ominously in his mind, filling him with dread. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. That evening, after Clara had gone to bed, James grabbed a flashlight and headed back outside. The night was eerily quiet, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers. He moved through the garden, his footsteps muffled by the soft grass, until he reached the spot where he had seen Paul digging. The rose bushes stood tall and proud, their petals dark and velvety in the moonlight. James crouched down, shining his flashlight on the ground. He pushed aside the dirt, his hands moving faster as his anxiety grew. After a few moments, he uncovered something, a tangled mass of roots, thick and sinewy, unlike anything he had ever seen. They seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive, twisting and turning like snakes coiled in the soil. James recoiled, dropping the flashlight. As he scrambled to his feet, the ivy on the garden walls seemed to move. The vines twisted and curled, creeping slowly, almost deliberately, towards him. James stumbled back, his heart racing as the ivy inched closer, its leaves rustling softly in the still night air. He bolted back to the house, slamming the door behind him, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. He peeked through the window, half expecting to see the ivy crawling up the walls, but it was still, as if it had never moved at all. James shook his head, trying to convince himself that his mind was playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew there was something horribly wrong with the garden, something that defied explanation. Upstairs, Clara stirred in her sleep, muttering softly to herself. James watched her from the doorway, wondering how much she knew, how much she was hiding. He crept into bed beside her, the weight of his discoveries pressing down on him. Clara's secrets were entwined with the garden, and James feared that whatever was buried there was just the beginning. James woke in the middle of the night to the sound of faint tapping on the window. He blinked groggily, glancing at the clock. 3:13 a.m. His heart pounded as he listened, straining to hear over the thumping of his own pulse. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like fingers drumming against the glass. He slowly turned his head towards the window, his breath catching in his throat. At first, he saw nothing but the darkness outside. But then a shadow moved, slow and deliberate. James squinted, his eyes adjusting to the gloom, and he realized with a jolt of terror that someone was standing just outside the window, staring in. James froze, too terrified to move. The figure was shrouded in darkness, but he could make out the shape of a man, his features obscured by the shadows. The tapping continued, rhythmic and purposeful, as if the visitor knew exactly what he was doing. James reached for his phone, his fingers trembling as he fumbled to turn on the flashlight. He pointed it towards the window, the beam cutting through the darkness. The figure recoiled, slipping out of view with a swift, unnatural movement. James leapt out of bed and rushed to the window, his heart hammering. He threw it open and peered outside, but there was no sign of anyone. The garden was silent, the ivy swaying gently in the breeze. Clara stirred beside him, her voice groggy with sleep. "What's going on?" "Nothing," James lied, his voice shaky. "Just thought I heard something." He closed the window and sat back down on the bed, his mind racing. He was certain that the figure had been Paul, watching him, waiting. But why? What did he want? And how long had he been lurking outside their home? James lay back down, his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. He knew he couldn't ignore the truth any longer. The garden, Paul, and Clara. They were all connected in a twisted web of lies and secrets. And now, someone was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. The next morning, James felt like he was living in a waking nightmare. Every corner of the house seemed to hold a shadow. Every creak of the floorboards made him jump. Clara moved through the day with her usual calm, but James could see the cracks in her facade. Nervous glances, fingers tapping anxiously on the countertop. He knew she was hiding something, and he was determined to find out what. While Clara was out shopping, James decided to search the house. He rifled through drawers, opened cabinets, and looked behind picture frames. He felt like a trespasser in his own home, but he didn't care. He was desperate for answers, and he wasn't going to stop until he found them. In the attic, he stumbled upon a dusty box labeled Memories. Inside, he found old photo albums, school yearbooks, and miscellaneous trinkets from their past. He flipped through the pages, feeling a pang of nostalgia, mixed with a deepening sense of dread. Everything seemed normal, but James knew that appearances could be deceiving. Then, tucked between the pages of an old album, he found a series of photographs that didn't belong. They were recent pictures of the garden, taken from odd angles. In some, Paul could be seen working, his face turned away from the camera. In others, Clara stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. James's stomach churned as he flipped through the photos, each one more damning than the last. The final photo stopped him cold. It was a close-up of the rose bushes, the same ones where James had found the bloody cloth. But there was something else in the picture, something half buried in the soil, a small, pale hand, just barely visible among the tangled roots. James dropped the photos, his mind reeling. He stumbled back, knocking over the box in his haste. The photos scattered across the floor, but James didn't care. He had seen enough. Whatever Clara and Paul were hiding, it was far worse than he had imagined. James felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead as he descended from the attic. He couldn't shake the image of the hand in the soil, pale and lifeless, hidden among the roots. His thoughts were a jumbled mess of fear and disbelief, but one thing was clear. He had to find out what was buried in the garden. As he paced the hallway, his eyes fell on the small shed at the far end of the garden. It was a place he rarely went, a cluttered storage space filled with old tools and gardening supplies. Clara had always kept it locked, saying it was just full of junk, But now, James wondered if that was another lie. With shaking hands, James grabbed a spare key from the kitchen drawer and headed outside. The shed loomed before him, its wooden door weathered and splintered. He hesitated for a moment, the key poised in the lock. A sense of dread washed over him, but he pushed it aside and turned the key. The door creaked open, revealing the dim interior. James stepped inside, his nose wrinkling at the musty smell of earth and rust. He fumbled for the light switch, and a single bulb flickered to life, casting eerie shadows across the walls. James's eyes swept over the room, taking in the cluttered shelves and discarded tools. But something in the corner caught his attention, a large tarp draped over a lumpy shape. His heart pounded as he approached, his hands trembling. He grabbed the edge of the tarp and pulled it back. Underneath, he found a large wooden crate, sealed shut with rusty nails. James's mind raced. What could be inside? He grabbed a crowbar from the wall and pried the crate open, the wood splintering under the pressure. Inside, wrapped in a stained sheet, was a bundle that reeked of decay. James gagged at the smell, his hands shaking as he unwrapped the cloth. What he saw made his blood run cold. A small, misshapen doll, crudely sewn together from bits of fabric and what looked disturbingly like human hair. Its eyes were black buttons, sewn on with jagged stitches, and its mouth was a crooked line of red thread. But it wasn't just a doll. It was covered in symbols, strange markings that James couldn't understand. They seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the air around them heavy and suffocating. James stumbled back, the crowbar slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. He bolted from the shed, slamming the door shut behind him. He leaned against the wall, gasping for breath, his mind spinning. Whatever Clara and Paul were doing, it was far beyond infidelity. It was something dark, something twisted, and it was growing right under his nose. That evening, Clara returned home, her mood noticeably lighter. She hummed softly as she unpacked groceries, her movements fluid and graceful. But James couldn't look at her the same way. Every smile, every casual gesture seemed rehearsed, part of an elaborate charade. They sat down for dinner, the silence between them thicker than usual. James watched Clara carefully, searching her face for any sign of guilt or fear. But she was unreadable, her expression calm and composed. James felt a surge of frustration. How could she act so normal when there were so many dark secrets lurking just beneath the surface? Halfway through the meal, Clara's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen, her smile faltering for a split second before she turned the phone over. James caught the brief flicker of an unknown number and felt his pulse quicken. "Who was that?" James asked, his voice tight. Clara shrugged, her tone casual. "Just a spam call?" James nodded, forcing himself to stay calm. He knew she was lying, but he couldn't confront her, not yet. He needed more proof, something undeniable that would force her to tell the truth. But every moment he spent in her presence made his skin crawl, the walls of their home closing in like a prison. After dinner, Clara retreated to the living room, settling in with a book. James watched her from the doorway, his mind racing. He thought about the photos in the attic, the strange doll in the shed, and the buried secrets in the garden. Clara was hiding something terrible, and James was determined to uncover it. As Clara flipped through the pages, James noticed a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips. It was the kind of smile that spoke of secrets kept and lies told. James clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He couldn't trust her anymore, and the realization cut deeper than any betrayal. Clara glanced up, her eyes meeting his. "Is everything okay?" James forced a smile, the bitterness burning in his throat. "Yeah," he lied, his voice hollow. "Everything's fine." But as he turned away, he knew that nothing was fine. The truth was lurking, waiting to be uncovered, and James was ready to dig it up, no matter how deep he had to go. James couldn't shake the feeling that the garden held the answers he was looking for. That night, after Clara had gone to bed, he grabbed a shovel and ventured outside. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale, eerie light over the garden. The shadows of the trees loomed like specters, their branches swaying in the breeze. He headed for the rose bushes, the spot where he had found the bloody cloth and seen the buried hand in the photo. James began to dig, his movements frantic and desperate. The soil was loose, as if it had been disturbed recently, and James's heart raced with anticipation. As he dug deeper, the ground gave way, revealing something hard and solid. James knelt down, brushing away the dirt with his hands. His breath caught in his throat as he uncovered a small wooden box, similar to the one he had found in the shed. But this one was smaller, more ornate, with strange symbols carved into the lid. James hesitated, a cold shiver running down his spine. He knew he should stop, that whatever was inside wasn't meant to be found. But his curiosity and his need for answers overpowered his fear. He pried the lid open, the wood creaking in protest. Inside, wrapped in a tattered piece of cloth, was a small, fragile skeleton. James recoiled, his stomach lurching. It was the remains of a baby, its tiny bones brittle and broken. James stared in horror, the realization crashing over him like a wave. This was no ordinary burial. It was something far more sinister. As he stumbled back, James heard a soft rustling behind him. He spun around, the shovel clenched tightly in his hand. But there was no one there, just the garden, silent and still. James's mind raced. Had Paul buried this here? Or was it Clara? And why? James quickly covered the grave, his hands shaking. He knew he had to confront Clara, to demand answers. But as he turned to head back to the house, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The ivy, creeping up the side of the house, moving as if it were alive. James bolted inside, slamming the door shut. He leaned against it, his breath ragged, his mind spinning. The garden was cursed, poisoned by secrets and lies. And whatever was buried there wasn't just a body. It was a warning. James didn't sleep that night. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts of the hidden grave and the creeping ivy. Every noise in the house seemed amplified, every creak and groan like a whisper in the dark. He felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of the secrets he was uncovering. Around 3 a.m., James heard it again, the tapping at the window. He sat up, his heart pounding, his eyes scanning the room. The tapping was soft, barely audible, but it was there, rhythmic and insistent. James reached for his phone, ready to call the police, but then the tapping stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a faint voice, muffled and distorted, echoed through the walls. James froze, straining to hear. It was a child's voice, soft and pleading, repeating the same words over and over. "Help me. Please help me." James felt a chill run down his spine. He got out of bed, his movements slow and deliberate, as if any sudden motion might provoke whatever was haunting the house. He followed the sound, his footsteps light on the creaky floorboards. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the walls like a trapped spirit. James pressed his ear against the wall, his breath shallow. The voice grew louder, more desperate, as if the child were right there, just beyond the plaster. James's hands shook as he pulled at the wallpaper, tearing it away in strips. But behind it was just more wall, solid, unyielding, and maddeningly silent. He pounded his fist against the wall, his frustration boiling over. The voice stopped abruptly, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. James stood there, panting, his forehead pressed against the cold plaster. He felt like he was losing his mind, the weight of the secrets and lies crushing him from all sides. As he returned to bed, Clara stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "James, what's wrong?" James shook his head, unable to find the words. How could he explain the horrors he was uncovering, the creeping dread that filled every corner of their home? Clara watched him for a moment, her expression unreadable, before rolling over and drifting back to sleep. James lay back down, his mind churning. He knew he couldn't keep this up. The truth was closing in, and soon there would be nowhere left to hide. But for now, he could only wait, listening to the whispers in the walls, and wonder what other secrets the house and Clara were keeping. The following day, James couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive, pulsating with secrets and hidden horrors. He roamed the halls, his eyes darting to every shadow, every crevice. The whispers from the night before lingered in his mind, each echo a haunting reminder of what was trapped within these walls. As he paced the upstairs hallway, he noticed something he had never paid attention to before, a faint outline on the wall, barely visible beneath the faded wallpaper. It was a seam, perfectly square, as if someone had once sealed off a doorway. James felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it, another hidden piece of the puzzle. He ran to the garage, grabbing a hammer and chisel, his heart pounding with anticipation. He worked quickly, prying at the seam until the plaster began to crumble away. Behind it was a small, narrow door, locked with a rusty padlock. James hesitated, the enormity of what he was about to uncover settling over him like a heavy shroud. But he had come too far to turn back now. With a final, determined strike, the padlock snapped open. James pushed the door, and it creaked open, revealing a steep, narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The air was damp and cold, the smell of mildew and rot assaulting his senses. James descended cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the thick gloom. At the bottom of the stairs, he found himself in a small, windowless room. The walls were lined with old photographs, faded and yellowed with age. They were pictures of the house, the garden, and people James didn't recognize, except for one. In the center of the wall was a photograph of Clara, much younger, standing beside an older man who James assumed was her father. They were in the garden, near the rose bushes, smiling for the camera. But there was something off about the photo. Clara's smile was strained, her eyes wide and fearful, as if she were being forced to pose. James felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He scanned the room, his flashlight beam revealing more unsettling details. A dusty old crib, its bars chipped and worn. Children's toys scattered across the floor, covered in cobwebs. And on a small table, a half-burned candle, its wax pooling on the surface. James moved closer to the table, his eyes catching on a small notebook, similar to the one Paul had shown him. He picked it up, flipping through the pages. They were filled with the same strange symbols he had seen on the doll, interspersed with crude sketches of a garden, a house, and a woman. Always the same woman, with Clara's unmistakable features. James's hands shook as he flipped to the last page. It was a drawing of a child, her face twisted in fear, with the words "Help me" scrawled over and over in frantic, jagged handwriting. James dropped the notebook, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. He needed to get out of there. He needed answers, but this room, this shrine of secrets, offered only more questions. As he backed towards the stairs, he noticed a faint sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like the one he'd heard at the window. James spun around, his flashlight beam darting across the room. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, echoing off the walls. And then, from the darkness, he heard it. The voice of the child, faint and distant, calling out to him. "Help me! Please help me!" James bolted up the stairs, slamming the door behind him. He leaned against it, gasping for breath, his mind reeling. The house was haunted by something that Clara had been a part of for far longer than James had realized. James knew he couldn't keep Clara in the dark any longer. That evening, as they sat down for dinner, he felt the tension between them reach a breaking point. Clara moved through the meal with her usual grace, but James could see the unease in her eyes, the way she avoided his gaze. Halfway through dinner, James set down his fork, his hands shaking. "I found something today," he said, his voice low. Clara looked up, her expression carefully neutral. "What did you find?" James stared at her, searching for any flicker of guilt or fear. "A room," he said slowly, "behind a hidden door. It's filled with pictures of you and a child." Clara's face blanched, her fork clattering to her plate. "You shouldn't have gone in there," she whispered, her voice trembling. James's anger flared. "You've been lying to me, Clara. About everything. About Paul, about the garden, about—" He hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "About the child." Clara's eyes welled with tears, but James felt no sympathy. He had spent too long in the dark, too long believing the lies. Who is she, Clara? Who is the child? Clara shook her head, her hands gripping the edge of the table. It's not what you think, she said, her voice barely audible. Please, James, you have to believe me. James slammed his fist on the table, the plates rattling. I believed you for too long. Now I want the truth. Clara's shoulders slumped, her expression crumbling. She looked up at James, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and sadness. Her name was Emily, Clara said, her voice breaking. She was my sister. James felt a chill run through him. He had never heard Clara mention a sister. What happened to her? Clara wiped her eyes, her gaze distant. She died when we were young. It was an accident. My father, he blamed me, said I had to make it right. James's mind reeled. What does that have to do with the garden? With Paul? Clara hesitated, her eyes darting to the window. Paul, he's helping me fix what happened. My father, he made me promise I would never let Emily go, that I would keep her safe. But I couldn't save her. James's heart pounded. Clara, what are you saying? Clara's gaze locked onto his, her expression desperate. Emily's spirit, it's trapped here. In the house. In the garden. And Paul, he knows how to set her free. James stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. This is insane. You're saying you've been keeping your sister's spirit here? For what, Clara? For what? Clara buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. James felt a surge of conflicting emotions, anger, fear, confusion. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, but all he could do was stand there, staring at the woman he thought he knew, and wonder what other horrors were buried in the past. That night, James couldn't sleep. Clara's confession had shattered his understanding of their life, leaving him adrift in a sea of questions with no answers. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the whispers from the hidden room echoing in his mind. Emily's spirit, trapped and pleading. Clara's desperate attempt to make things right. And Paul, what was his role in all of this? Unable to stand the silence any longer, James got up and wandered the house. His footsteps were soft on the hardwood floors, the creaks and groans of the old house filling the stillness. He found himself drawn to the garden, the moonlight casting an eerie glow over the roses. James walked among the flowers, his eyes scanning the shadows. He knew he wouldn't find peace until he understood what Clara and Paul were doing. He thought of the strange symbols, the buried bones, the creeping ivy. Everything pointed to some kind of ritual, but James couldn't grasp the full picture. As he neared the center of the garden, James saw movement near the shed. He ducked behind a tree, peering through the branches. Paul was there, hunched over, muttering under his breath. In his hands, he held a bundle of dried herbs, their scent wafting through the air. James watched as Paul arranged the herbs in a circle, sprinkling a dark, powdery substance over them. James's heart raced. This was it, the ritual Clara had mentioned. Paul was preparing something, some dark ceremony meant to release Emily's spirit. But as James watched, he realized it was more than just a simple release. Paul's movements were deliberate, the symbols he traced in the dirt complex and intricate. This wasn't just about setting a spirit free. It was something darker, something dangerous. Paul lit a candle, the flame flickering in the breeze. He knelt in the center of the circle, his eyes closed, his lips moving in silent prayer. James's stomach churned. He needed to stop this. Whatever Paul was doing, it felt wrong, twisted. James stepped forward, his foot snapping a twig. Paul's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto James. For a moment, they stared at each other, the tension crackling in the air. Paul's expression was unreadable, but James saw a flicker of something. Fear, anger, or perhaps both. Go back inside, Paul said, his voice low and commanding. This isn't for you. James shook his head, his fists clenched. I'm not going anywhere. I want to know what you're doing. Paul stood, his silhouette looming. Paul stepped out of the circle, his eyes narrowing as he approached James. The candle flame flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the garden. The air felt charged, heavy with an unsettling energy that made James's skin crawl. "You don't understand," Paul said, his voice calm but with an edge of urgency. "This ritual isn't just about setting a spirit free. It's about righting a wrong that's been festering for decades." James held his ground, his heart pounding. "Clara told me about Emily. But this isn't how you fix things." Paul shook his head, a grim smile on his face. "It's not that simple. Emily's spirit is trapped because of what happened, and it's not just Clara's fault. Her father, he dabbled in things he didn't understand. He bound Emily's soul to this place, hoping to keep her close, but all he did was imprison her in torment." James felt a cold chill seep into his bones. The truth was more twisted than he could have imagined. Clara's father hadn't just been a controlling, grieving parent. He had trapped Emily's spirit in a cursed ritual, a desperate attempt to hold on to his dead daughter. "And Clara?" James asked, his voice tight. "She's been living with this her whole life?" Paul nodded, his expression softening. "She's been trying to atone, to undo what her father did. But it's not easy. This ritual, it's the only way to finally set Emily free. But it's dangerous. If we get it wrong." James didn't need Paul to finish the sentence. He knew the stakes. He glanced at the garden, the roses swaying in the wind, the dark, twisting ivy creeping up the walls. Everything felt wrong, off balance, as if the very ground beneath them was ready to swallow them whole. Paul picked up the candle and returned to the circle, his movements precise and deliberate. He gestured for James to step back, his eyes never leaving the ritual's center. "Stay back," Paul warned. "This isn't for you." James watched, torn between his fear and his desperate need for answers. Paul resumed the ritual, chanting in a low, guttural voice that sent shivers down James's spine. The wind picked up, swirling around them, carrying the scent of decay and something else, something metallic, like blood. The ground beneath the circle began to tremble, and a candle flame flickered violently. Paul's voice grew louder, his chants mingling with the rustling of the leaves and the distant whispers of the house. James felt a sharp pain in his chest, as if the very air around him was squeezing his heart. Suddenly, the circle erupted in a blinding flash of light. James shielded his eyes, stumbling backward. The garden seemed to pulse with energy, the ivy writhing like snakes. And then, just as quickly, the light vanished, plunging them into darkness. When James looked up, Paul was on his knees, his face twisted in agony. The circle was scorched, the herbs reduced to ash. But there in the center was a figure, a small, ghostly silhouette of a child, her eyes wide and empty. James's breath caught in his throat. It was Emily. Emily's spirit hovered in the circle, her form flickering like a weak flame. She looked at James, her expression filled with a sorrow so deep it was almost unbearable. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out, her silent pleas echoing in the stillness of the night. Paul struggled to his feet, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "It didn't work," he muttered, his voice cracking. "She's still trapped. We're too late." James felt a crushing weight settle on his chest. All of this, the secrets, the lies, the rituals, had been for nothing. Emily's spirit was still bound, and Clara's desperate attempts to set her free had failed. He glanced back at the house, the windows dark and foreboding, as if the very walls were watching, waiting. Paul turned to James, his eyes filled with regret. "You have to leave. Get Clara out of here. This place, it's cursed. It'll never let her go." James nodded, his mind racing. He knew Paul was right. The house, the garden, it was all a prison built on pain and lies. He sprinted back inside, his footsteps echoing in the empty halls. He found Clara in the living room, staring blankly at the wall, tears streaming down her face. "Clara," James said, grabbing her arm. "We have to go. Now." Clara shook her head, her eyes distant. "I can't leave her. She's still here. She's always been here." James felt a surge of frustration. He pulled Clara to her feet, his grip firm. "We'll find another way. But we can't stay here. Not anymore." As they made their way to the door, the house seemed to groan, the walls closing in around them. The whispers grew louder, the child's voice mixing with Clara's sobs. James pushed forward, dragging Clara with him, his only thought to get her to safety. But as they reached the threshold, the ground beneath them split open, a gaping chasm that swallowed the garden and the house in a deafening roar. James tried to pull Clara back, but the force was too strong. The air was filled with the sound of cracking wood, shattering glass, and the relentless, mournful cries of a child who had been trapped for far too long. James lost his grip on Clara, and she was pulled into the abyss, her scream cut off by the crushing weight of the collapsing house. James fell back, the ground shaking beneath him, the world around him dissolving into chaos. When the dust settled, James was alone, lying on the cold, hard ground. The house was gone, reduced to rubble and twisted ivy. The garden was a barren wasteland, the roses wilted and dead. James's heart ached, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. Clara was gone, Paul was gone, and Emily's spirit, still bound to this cursed place, would never be free. James staggered to his feet, his body aching, his mind numb. He turned away from the ruins, his steps heavy and unsteady. As he walked away, he could still hear the faint, sorrowful whisper of a child's voice, carried on the wind, a haunting reminder of the secrets that would forever remain buried in the Garden of Lies. And James knew that no matter how far he went, he would never escape the darkness that had claimed his home, his wife, and the truth he had so desperately sought.